Good morning, everyone. I am Laura Labanieh, your CalTRUST CEO. Thank you for joining us today for our Demystifying LGIPs and Liquidity Tools webinar. My apologies for our few-minute delay in getting started as I was experiencing some technical difficulties, but I think we should be good to go now. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. It's always my pleasure to be able to provide you some educational opportunities and share part of my morning with you. Joining me today, we have Will Goldthwait with State Street Global Advisors. He's a portfolio strategist. State Street Global Advisors, for those of you who don't know, offers the investment management of the CalTRUST funds. And so we do a lot of our education in conjunction with them. We encourage you to please take advantage of these educational opportunities today, ask questions, use the chat, use the Q&A, and let us know how we can help you as we go through this. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and start into our program. So our goals today are to really demystify what an LGIP is and what liquidity tools are available to you. So we're going to kind of walk through and define, explain what these mean, what options are available to you, and talk about what you should ask when you're looking at investing in an LGIP or some other liquidity tool. What are your considerations? Will, do you have anything else to add on kind of our objectives today before we jump right in?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize, Laura, I think your point is great, is that like what we want to get across today is questions that you should be asking. And I think it's super important whenever you're making an investment into the capital markets, whether it's through a liquidity pool or an SEC registered vehicle or even direct investing, it's really important to ask a lot of questions and get a lot of opinions about that investment before you make it.
Absolutely. Okay, so the first thing we'll talk about today are LGIPs, local government investment pools. As you are aware, most likely if you are on this webinar, CalTRUST is a local government investment pool. So the first thing we hear from a lot of people who aren't familiar with pools is, how do I know that I'm allowed to invest in an LGIP? It's very straightforward. California Government Code 53601, as you know, is kind of your guidelines of what you can invest in as a public agency in California. And it explicitly allows for the use of JPA LGIPs. It is Section P. And so one thing you do need to look at, though, is your agency's investment policy may be more restrictive than 53601. So if you're looking to invest in an LGIP and you don't currently invest in one, you may need to amend your agency's code policy statement to allow for the use of that instrument. So that's one thing that's really important to look at. Now, how do these work? What is kind of the basic behind the LGIP is a JPA. So a JPA is a Joint Powers Authority. And JPAs are public agencies. So therefore, they can only invest in the same instruments allowable to all California public agencies as authorized by 53601. So if you're investing in a JPA LGIP in California, you can rest assured that their guidelines have to mirror 53601 as well, or being compliant, because they are a public agency ourselves. So CalTRUST, we are a joint powers authority. We are a public agency providing a service to you. Government Code 6500 clarifies that LGIP JPAs are authorized for use by California public agencies. So your investment guidelines in 53601P explicitly allow for it. And then also in Government Code Section 6500, it explicitly allows for it. That's a kind of a lot of the background and kind of legalese on why you can do this. Will, do you have anything to add to those points before I move on?
I think the part that I would add is, there's certainly laws, regulations. It's critically important to read those, interpret those. If you have to get outside counsel involved, then you should certainly do that. And this really carries forward into how you write your investment policy statement. And I think that's really, really important. And that investment policy statement should be reviewed on a semi-frequent basis. I know some folks that review it semi-annually, annually, even biannually, whatever it is, just to make sure that that policy gets looked at, because things are always changing in the marketplace. You know, liquidity pools are coming and going. Some are getting bigger, some are getting smaller. Some of the laws or the rules around those liquidity pools have changed, or the market has changed around those liquidity pools and they haven't, caught up. So it's really important to sort of get into the weeds on this stuff, and we're going to spend the next several minutes talking about exactly sort of what attributes you should be thinking about from those JPAs.
Great, thank you. So I talked through this. We're not going to read through all this fine print, but this will be in the information that we share with you after, kind of the language that explicitly allows from 6500 as well. So how are LGIP JPAs structured? Again, one of the key points that was clarified in the early 2000s. It's actually something that CalTRUST, when we started, we went back and had language clarified in code, is that in order to participate in an LGIP JPA, your public agency does not have to join the JPA. So unlike most joint powers authorities where you have to become a member of the JPA, for an LGIP JPA, you are able to participate without having to actually become a full member of the JPA. So typical operating structure of a JPA starts with the stakeholders, right? The stakeholders are our shareholders. So that's you, the folks that entrust us to manage your funds, the public agencies that invest. From there, you have the governing body. So the governing body would be a board of trustees. So they set policy, they have oversight, the management team, oversight of the running of the JPA themselves. The shareholders are pretty straightforward. It's you. The governing body can vary in how they are formed based on the different LGIP JPAs. For example, with CalTRUST, our governing body is a board of trustees that can flex between 5 and 15 members. The way we get JPA governing body members for our board of trustees is that folks come to us, or we have conversations with folks who are interested in serving on the board of trustees. They share their interest with CalTRUST. The CalTRUST board of trustees members review it, interview them, talk about it, and then discuss if they are someone who has the knowledge and expertise to serve on the board. And then it goes out to a vote of all of our JPA members to approve the board of trustees. So that's one way. That's how CalTRUST does it. There are other LGIP JPAs in the state that do it differently. Some may be appointed by other agencies, and others may be also kind of voted on and approved from the membership of the JPA or the shareholders, the same way CalTRUST is. So that's one thing you want to look at with the operating structure of your JPAs is how is the governing body formed? From there, the next step is you have the management. Will, did you want to add anything on that? Okay, great. The management. So this is the day-to-day oversight, the operations of the Joint Powers Authority of the shares program. So these are who has direct oversight on a day-to-day basis of the service providers, who is servicing the shareholders every day, who is reporting up to the governing body. And this also can vary based on the different JPA LGIPs in California. For example, CalTRUST, the management, myself, the chief executive officer, all of our staff, we are independent. We are actually CalTRUST employees. We are public agency employees, beholden only to the CalTRUST Board of Trustees. In other structures, you may see that the management and staffing are some of the service providers. So it's another common practice in some LGIPs that the management is provided by the investment management team, and that company actually provides the management instead of it being independent. So that's just one other piece that can vary that you'll want to look at if you're investing in a JPA and say, how are they managed? Is the management independent? Is the management tied to a service provider? Because that can have implications on if service providers change and how oversight is done. The next level down on an operating structure for your LGIP JPAs are the service providers. So these are the companies on partners on a day-to-day basis actually doing kind of the nitty-gritty, the detail work. So for example, at CalTRUST, investment manager, our investment management team is State Street Global Advisors. We contract with them. Other service providers that any LGIP JPA is going to contract with would be your custodian, your fund accountant, your transfer agent, the auditor, legal counsel. So that's that last kind of layer of who's actually doing the behind the scenes work. One thing that is always really good to look at when you're looking at any agency, quite frankly, is how are those service providers chosen? Are they chosen via RFP? How often is that conducted? And that kind of consideration. At CalTRUST, for example, our policy is that we go to bid no longer than every 7 years. So we never have more than 7 years pass before we go to bid for our key service providers. And it can be as short as 3 years. The way we write all our contracts allow us to go to bid at any time so that we can make sure we are getting the best level of service and the best fee structure that we can for our service providers. So this is your typical operating structure. I say it's your typical structure. Basically in California, you have 3 JPA LGIP options, and this is really the structure that we all maintain with variation based on how shareholders are found, how the governing body is appointed or elected, how it's managed, and how service providers are selected. Before I keep talking at you, I'll see if Will has anything he'd like to add to this slide.
Yeah, that's great, Laura. So I guess what I would say is for the SEC registered liquidity products that are available in the market, from a structural standpoint, it looks similar, except for the fact that the governing body would be State Street Funds Management Board of Trustees, for example, in our, let's say, government SEC registered money market fund. The management would then be State Street, and then some of the service providers, obviously the investment manager would be State Street, but then even some of the service providers like the custodian could be State Street as well. So the difference there is pretty obvious. The management team at CalTRUST separate and distinct from the service providers, whereas in the typical investment manager model for SEC registered vehicles, they would be one and the same. So SSGA, BlackRock, Federated, the like, they would all be within themselves. Their board, the management team, and then some of the service providers. We could outsource, any of those things. The custodian, the fund accountant, the transfer agent, obviously the auditor, legal counsel, or in some cases like legal counsel, transfer agent, fund accounting, that could be within the organization. So it's just something that if you did have concerns about that, you'd want to just specifically ask those questions. How are the separations of duties determined? What happens if you're dissatisfied with any particular part of that? Just as Laura said, every 7 years she's required to go out to RFP to evaluate services, but often, Laura, you could do that sooner, certainly sooner than 7 years.
And I have.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. So this is kind of a basic overview of the JPA LGIPs in California, why you're allowed to invest in us, how we're structured. There are other local government investment pools in California. One of them is, I'm sure most of you or all of you on the line are probably familiar with this one, LAIF, the California's Local Agency Investment Fund. Government Code 16429-1 is what explicitly allows you to invest in LAIF. And then there's also county treasurers pools, which are under Government Code 53864. Now, there are some variations in these, whereas your LGIP JPAs are managed as their own separate entities. These are different, they're nuanced. LAIF is the state's fund, as you know. And so that's a much larger beast. It is actually part of the state's larger fund, PMIA, and it's managed a little bit differently. Once upon a time, it was the only LGIP option available to most of you. And then our JPAs have grown over time, so you have more options now. Um, and then there are the county pools. So each county treasurer has their own pool as well for agencies within their county to invest in. I'm not going to go into much of any detail at all on county pools because it varies drastically county to county. So you'll want to talk to your county treasurer about their pool. Some counties allow for only mandated agencies to invest in them, and other counties allow for public agencies within the county that aren't mandated voluntary agencies to invest in them. So that's something that's nuanced that you'll want to talk to your county about if you're interested in the county pool. With LAIF, you're going to see a lot of differences between LAIF and the JPA LGIPs in California. Really, it's part of how it's functioned as a function of the state. One, LAIF does have more limitations than you'll see from other JPAs. I believe LAIF's cap is around 75 million, whereas CalTRUST, we have no cap on how much you're allowed to invest with us. Same, we don't have any cap on number of transactions, whereas LAIF still has a 15 limit transaction cap. They also require extra liquidity or notice on liquidity if you want to withdraw larger amounts. So there are a lot of operational differences between LAIF and CalTRUST in that regard. You also want to look at, if you're comparing different investment options and LGIPs, the duration of the funds. We'll talk a little bit kind of about how CalTRUST is structured versus how LAIF is structured in that. The ratings, CalTRUST and the other LGIPs in California, JPAs, were all rated. Some county pools are rated, some are not. LAIF is not rated. So there's a lot of differences there that really you're not looking at kind of apples to apples when you're comparing LAIF to the other LGIPs in California because they're just structured so differently as having been born out of this larger fund at the state level. And I'll ask Will if he wants to add a little bit more kind of about some of the differences there.
Yeah, I think when we think about liquidity pools and managing liquidity pools, and as listeners on the line know, CalTrust has three investment options: the liquidity pool, short-term and medium-term fund. When we think about in the construct of liquidity management, we think about duration being a big component on how quickly and easily you can get your money back. And the CalTrust liquidity pool has a duration limit of no more than 60 days. In other words, we can't take the duration of that fund beyond 60 days. And in fact, we're going to tend to run it much shorter than that because we know that at any given day, at any given moment, you could call us, you, the investor, could call us and want to have your money back because you need to make some payment. You've got infrastructure that you've got to work on. You've got any sort of payments that need to go out. And so therefore you need that liquidity. And so then when we think about risk, just a general rule that I like to use is, how soon do you need that money should be somewhat correlated to the duration of that product. In other words, if you've got a product that is 60 day, a liquidity pool that's 60 days or shorter, and that also includes SEC registered money market funds, then you could think about, okay, that's money that's short. It's 2 months or less in duration. Therefore, I can use that money sort of anytime I want. The investment manager and the provider, the governing body, knows that that is a short-term liquidity vehicle. When you start to go beyond 2 months in duration, then you start to think about that in the context of your holding period. So if you have something that's 6 months duration, then you want to be thinking about owning that for at least 6 months, at least. Something that's 1 year duration, you want to be thinking about owning that for at least 1 year. And the reason for that is because if we have an event like 2022, where yields move dramatically higher in a pretty short amount of time, you don't want to be stuck trying to redeem from something that has a lot of unrealized losses. And we did a whole webinar on variable NAV products and on the fact that when yields go higher, you could have unrealized losses, and we wouldn't want to see you recognize those unrealized losses and make them realized losses. So a general rule of thumb is that your holding period should be somewhat correlated to the duration of the pool, but there's a whole bunch of other attributes that go into that as well: maturity ladder, credit ratings, fund ratings, et cetera. And we'll dig into that a little bit more as we go.
Great, thank you. I do want to remind folks, please go ahead and use the Q&A to inquire if you have any questions or any follow-ups as we move through this presentation, so we're being as helpful as we can. So I am going to ask Will now to talk a little bit more. He's mentioned other SEC registered options. So I'm going to hand it over and ask Will to talk about other liquidity options that are available to you and kind of go through what else is available in our world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Laura. So the other option that's available to you is other SEC registered money market funds. Now, obviously, the name sort of says it all. These are mutual funds that are registered with the SEC. They have to follow a specific list of rules outlined by the SEC. And those rules define the risk characteristics of those funds. The biggest category in that space is government money market funds. And government money market funds are money market mutual funds that are only allowed to invest in US Treasuries, government agencies, and then repurchase agreements backed by that collateral. So these funds are very, very big. They could be, tens of billions in size. Ours is over 180 billion in size, and it sees all sorts of cash flows coming and going from it each and every day. Additionally, that fund uses an accounting method, amortized cost accounting, so it trades at a steady dollar. It's not guaranteed, but it does use amortized cost accounting and trades at a steady dollar so that those cash flows coming in and out happen at the dollar, the same way the CalTRUST liquidity pool operates. From a duration standpoint, from a risk standpoint, there's two rules that we need to follow. One is weighted average maturity, which is a measure of sensitivity to changes in interest rates. And that's something that has to be 60 days or less. 60 days is the maximum limit. And typically you won't see fund managers run it, much into the 50-day category. They certainly don't want to be bumping right up against 60 days. So they're going to probably run it. Max duration might be 50 days. And then could be run as short as single digits, 6, 7, 8 days. So during 2022, when interest rates were spiking so much higher so fast, we ran that duration on our funds very, very short, like in the single digits. Being able to have the rate on those funds adjust very quickly, particularly when the Fed was raising interest rates by 75 basis points at a time. The other duration category that we keep an eye on is weighted average life. And this is a measure of the final maturity of a bond. So in the case of a floating rate note, where that rate might reset every day, what is the final maturity of the bond? Like, when is that bond going to mature? If it's a year, then the weighted average life of that bond would be 365 days, 1 year. So we look at that as an average in the portfolio as well, and that cannot be longer than 120 days or even slightly shorter, depending on rating agency rating. So these are important questions for you to ask when you're investing in a product: is what are the duration limits, and how far out can you go from a final maturity standpoint as well. That's another constraint that the SEC has put on these funds, as well as the CalTRUST liquidity pool, is you are not allowed to buy anything longer than 397 days. There are exceptions in the case of U.S. Treasury or government agency floating rate notes. Those could be as long as 2 years if the reset happens 1 year or shorter. So I don't want to confuse folks. If you look into the portfolio and you see something that matures in 18 months or 2 years, that's why, because it's got to be a floating rate note that would be able to reset in the event that interest rates changed in the marketplace. So those are very important duration components. On top of that, there's diversification requirements. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I want to introduce another product that sits in the SEC world, and that's prime money market funds. Now, prime money market funds got into a little bit of hot water back in 2008 during the great financial crisis. And what happened there is some prime funds owned Lehman Brothers paper, and so therefore they had a challenge around that name. And so the SEC did not like this at all because there was some very fast redemptions, or what was said to be a run on these funds. So the SEC changed the rules pretty dramatically in 2016, and then they changed the rules again this year. So now institutional prime money market funds, or those that are available only to institutions, not retail, must use a variable NAV, so their NAV must float. Additionally, they live under a liquidity construct or liquidity rule construct, meaning that if they have redemptions of 5% or more in a given day, they need to determine whether that redemption causes an adverse effect on the remaining shareholders and if a liquidity fee must be imposed. I won't go into all of the details of that rule for this call, but I will say that this has had a pretty dramatic effect on the industry. And we've seen a significant number of these funds close. And we don't view it as similar to a CalTRUST liquidity pool or other JPAs in the state of California that are able to continue to use amortized cost accounting, trade at a $1 NAV, and are not subject to liquidity rules. So I just want to emphasize that CalTRUST's liquidity pool and other liquidity pools like that in the state of California can continue to use amortized cost accounting. They don't have liquidity fees that could be applied. So they're very, very different than the SEC registered prime money market funds. So with that said, really the way folks are using money market funds in the SEC registered space is the government funds or treasury funds. And the only difference between a government money market fund and a treasury money market fund is the treasury money market funds can only buy US treasuries, and they cannot by any government agency like Federal Home Loan, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They're not allowed to buy any of that paper. They can only buy US treasuries, and that's really the main difference. Lastly, before I hand it back to you, Laura, I'll just say that for the most part in the SEC space, and this is probably a good segue to talk about ratings on LGIPs as well, is most part in the SEC registered money market space, they are all receiving rating agency ratings. So S&P, Moody's, and Fitch being the majority. And so those rating agencies are coming in with additional oversight. We send them daily reports, we send them holdings. They're able to see what's going on in the portfolio. And so that's another level of safety and security that those rating agencies are providing by having a second pair of eyes. And Laura, why don't I hand it back to you and you could talk a little bit about the ratings on CalTRUST as well.
Great, thank you. Before I get into that, I did have a question come through, and you were talking about duration earlier. And someone was asking if you put money into a fund, considering duration, do you typically see an unrealized loss if you keep it in for that duration, or will holding to a duration affect whether or not you see an unrealized loss? Before I hand it over to you to kind of preface that, the first thing you have to consider when asking a question like that is what fund you're looking at. If your fund has a stable or a floating net asset value, In our CalTRUST Liquidity Fund, for example, we are a stable net asset value fund. And the two other LGIPs in California, their main funds are also stable net asset value funds. So that's not going to be a consideration. You're going to have that more of a consideration if you're invested in a floating net asset value fund. So the CalTRUST short-term fund and our medium-term fund, which are our longer duration funds, those are floating net asset value funds. Those are where realized, unrealized losses and gains are more of a consideration. So I wanted to go ahead and put that preface out there before I ask Will to address that question.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that is the most important part is that, yes, 2022 was an extreme example. And the interest rate moves we saw, those vehicles that had variable NAVs or floating NAVs did show unrealized losses in those portfolios, which then could mean if you held that portfolio, you would also have an unrealized loss. I think this is the part where I really emphasize holding period because if you got to the end of 2022 and you saw those unrealized losses, you would then have to consider, well, do I want to continue to be in this fund? Ultimately, over time or over a full business cycle, you should expect to see that unrealized loss start to work out of the portfolio as bonds mature and are reinvested at whatever the current coupon is. Bonds continue to roll down, mature, get reinvested. But if you need that money back straight away and you have to redeem from that fund, then it's very possible that you could generate a realized loss on that sale. So I think the part that I want to emphasize here is that holding period is so important to allow time for bonds to roll down and mature without having to be sold, without having to generate that loss and then be reinvested at a current coupon.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's something that people ask a lot and have a lot of question around. Great question. So talking a little bit about ratings now. So our CalTrust funds are all rated. Our liquidity fund is rated. We're all rated by Standard & Poor's. And the way they rate our liquidity fund is how they look at money market funds. So we have a triple AM rating on our liquidity fund. The other LGIP JPAs in California who also have the same structure stable NAV fund also have that same rating and go through the same rating process. That's one interesting point I will make is when you're looking at these LGIPs and your JPA options in California, the structure of our liquidity fund and their equivalents are very, very similar. You're not going to see much difference at all. We have the same restrictions. We're holding to the same ratings information. So that's all going to be very similar. Where you're really going to see the difference is in the governance and the management and the service providers between those funds. And then our short and medium term fund are also rated. Our short-term fund has a AA-F S1 plus rating, and our medium term has a AA minus F S1 rating. Now, why does it matter to be rated? What are they, what does a rating add? One really interesting thing that I love about the ratings process is that this isn't just like a once a year, they look at the funds and tell you how you're doing. This actually requires weekly vigilance, and there are reports that are sent weekly to S&P. And so they actually look on a regular basis when your funds are rated on how are you functioning? Are you beholden to your own criteria? Are you beholden to the code? And so it's really a great extra layer of ongoing oversight and vigilance. And so I think it really is a value add when you go through the ratings process. The once a year meeting we do is kind of a summary, but there's ongoing stuff throughout the year, which really adds that extra layer of just oversight to the funds, which I think is really interesting. So that's what
Yeah.
I'll say about ratings. I think is kind of the key point with what makes them, more valuable than just having the rating assigned.
Yeah, I think I just add to that, Laura, it's the subject matter expert, right? I mean, these folks are trained. Not only are they rating, LGIPs, they're also rating SEC registered funds. They're experts in the field. They can see what other ratings look like in other states. And so that should really give comfort to shareholders within the CalTRUST LGIP and others, that there's another set of eyes that are experts in this field, keeping an eye, asking questions, checking in, similar to the answers that I get often for those folks that are invested in pooled vehicles, right? Being invested in a pooled vehicle means that your money is in with a whole bunch of other folks, and everyone's keeping an eye on things. And I think that's a real value in pooled vehicles, is that you have a lot of eyes on what we're doing, on what Laura's doing, on what the CalTrust management team's doing, and I think that's great. I think that those extra eyes on the process are beneficial for everybody.
Absolutely. And I think those extra eyes really lead us into talking a little bit about transparency. Um, and as we look at now, we've talked a little bit about what is an LGIP GPA, how we exist and how you can invest in us and, these other funds, options. And again, please, ask additional questions as we're going. Is really now talking about like what considerations you need to look into when you're trying to figure out what's the best option for you, what are you comfortable with, and what are valuable options to add to your portfolio. And we don't have this specifically spelled out in here, but I think talking about extra eyes really leads to talking about transparency. And that is such a key thing, especially when you're looking at pooled options. You want to be able to look under the covers and feel comfortable that you know how the JPA is functioning, how the pool is being run, what are your underlying investments? What are you invested? Even though the pool itself is what's rated, who was investing in other securities? What does that look like? And so I think transparency is such a key point to look at. And as you see reports coming out from these third parties, that just gives a glimpse. But for yourself, you really want to ask, how easy is it for me to get information? How easy can I see the holdings? For example, on CalTrust, for our shareholders, you can log into the portal and all our holdings are available to you updated daily. So you can see what's there. Our audit, as soon as it's released, is posted to our website. So you can go look at the audit of the pools, and you should be looking at those things. You should know what is under this pool. What is it based on? So I think transparency is key. Even our education programs, we post them on our public site, so they're available to everyone. You don't have to be a shareholder with CalTrust to take advantage of what we put out there and what we're saying. And so I think that's another key piece is, how transparent is an organization? I think that's something you really want to make sure you're looking for. Other considerations along those lines that I think really key to look for when you're evaluating the different options out there are who is on the board of trustees, who's on the governing body, and how did they get there. That is a really key thing. Same with the management and operations. Who is overseeing the day-to-day? Who is my day-to-day staffing contact? Am I calling a generic line and getting whoever answers the phone who's going to look at my fund, or am I getting someone who's a dedicated provider? So those management operations are key to look at for both consistency as well as your shareholder experience. Who are the service providers? How long have they been there? When were they last RFP'd? What are the considerations that the LGIP is giving to how they're making their selections? I think that's really key. And then fees, right? You look at service providers, they charge fees, funds charge fees. And so that's another really important key question is, where can I clearly see the fee schedule defined? Am I going to know exactly what is being, what fees are being charged to the fund? And I think that's another key thing. For example, in CalTrust, it's at the end of our information statement. You see every fee broken down for each fund, and you know exactly what that's going to look like. And then also look at, like we just talked about, are the funds rated? Because we know that that has some weight to it. How long have the funds been established? What market cycles have they gone through, right? I mean, CalTrust was established in 2003. I've been working with CalTrust personally since 2008. I've already seen so many fun things that I didn't think I would see with our fund cycles. And so looking at when these funds are established and how they've been operating is important. And then, you want the funds to be easy to use, right? You want to have access to your money. You want it to have a good shareholder experience. What are the cutoff times? Are there limits on redemptions? How easy is it to get information? So, Will, can you expand on any other considerations and ways to look at it as you're evaluating our choices in this market?
Yeah, I mean, I I just want to go back to one part about holdings, and this is something that I've experienced a lot throughout my career. Is that when there's a crisis, people need to know answers really, really quickly. And I'll just go back to sort of a mini crisis we had back in March 2023 with those three and ultimately four major banks that failed. That was something where people wanted to know right away. Do you have any exposure to Credit Suisse? Do you have any exposure to Silicon Valley? Do you have any exposure to Signature? They really wanted to know straight away. And then ultimately, as things continued to develop around First Republic, people wanted to know. They wanted to see the holdings and they wanted to know if any of the bonds were in there, if they were there, what was the maturity of those bonds. And so this is something where it's just so important because it might not be you. You might know that there's no holdings because you might have talked to me or Laura or Todd or anyone or someone and we've told you that there's no holdings there, but it might be your boss or your boss's boss or your board or your overseer or whoever. And so I think from a transparency standpoint, that's really, really, really important. Um, the other thing that I think is also we get a lot of questions on this is fees. What's the value? I get a lot of questions around, oh, well, why don't I just do the investment myself?
Mhm.
Why don't I buy individual bonds? And so you can do the justification, the rationalization, right? If you want to set up relationships with various counterparties, if you want to manage the custodial process, the accounting process, and you think you can do it, then that's no problem. There's no argument, on that. But sometimes people look at that and they say, hey, you know what? These fees seem to be pretty reasonable. We spent a lot of time talking about the funds rating, and I think that's super important. The last thing I'd just say is operationally, you want this to be easy. It
Mhm.
should be easy. You want to be able to make a call, get picked up on the first or second ring, send an email, get a voicemail, or if you get voicemail, you get called right back. If you send an email, you get a prompt response. I mean, this is really, really important. It should not be hard to use these products. And so that's something that we would consider as well. And then within that, operational constraints, subscriptions and redemptions. Is that easy to do? Do you get a lot of, yeah, the answer we hope you get is sure, no problem. Sure, no problem regarding your subscriptions and redemptions. And so that's something that we would really want to emphasize.
No, absolutely. And you want a service, right? Look at us as service providers when you are using a fund. What other value add can your LGIP JPA that you participate in bring to your agency? For us, we are able to provide expertise directly to State Street Global advisors for our shareholders, for example. So many of you talked with Will and other folks from State Street, and not even just about your CalTrust accounts, but you might have questions on, how you're considering, positioning your portfolio based on projects you have coming up. And we allow for that expertise and encourage it and the usefulness of that. And we're always available here for you. So, we are here. Will, before I give any final thoughts, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to give?
No, I guess I do. I have one final thought. Um, is that it is a reasonable amount of work. And I think picking a liquidity pool, whether it's a California JPA, whether it's an SEC registered pool, it does take some work. And you do have to go and pull all of the documents that the fund provider is required to give you, but then could give you additional information. You need to review that. You need to talk to various people, ask difficult questions, and make sure you're getting good responses. So there is a bit of work. It's not as easy as just picking one and going, because that's really important for your own due diligence to make sure that you've answered all those tough questions, and gotten answers that are satisfactory, and allow you to do your job very easily and seamlessly.
Absolutely. And I would say too, regardless of whether or not you are a CalTrust shareholder, please don't hesitate to use us as a service. As I mentioned, we are, myself, my staff, we are public agency employees. We are here to be service providers to public agencies in California. I always say our public agency job is to provide public service to public agencies. And so feel free to take advantage of that. We can look at investment policy statements with you to see if your statement does allow for LGIP JPAs and help you with language if it doesn't, answer questions for you. So we are here. So please do take advantage of us as a resource available to you. With that said, we do have another webinar coming up on December 19th that I encourage everyone to register for. If you are not already, you can register on our website, caltrust.org, or if you're registered for this, you've seen it in the same emails. And that's our post-election reflection webinar with our political strategist from State Street Global Advisors. And I'm really looking forward to that discussion. It also falls the day after the last Fed meeting of the year. And so that's going to be a really engaging piece. And then in January, you'll see registration coming out for it soon. But in January, end of January, we'll be holding another webinar. That's our Coffee with CalTrust. And that is where we'll go into more specifics about CalTrust itself, a market update on our funds, and really kind of get more into the nitty gritty on our pools. And so that'll be coming out in the next week or so. We'll have that announced and you can start registering for that. But I appreciate Will for joining me this morning, and I appreciate everyone on this line for letting us share a portion of your morning with you. And for those of you who do invest in CalTrust, thank you for putting your confidence in us and letting us be of service to you. So that, I hope everyone has a wonderful Monday. Happy property tax week to everyone. We know that's on a lot of folks' minds right now. And so thank you so much. A copy of this will be posted to our website and shared with everyone this week. So thank you again, Will, and have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Laura. Appreciate it. Bye bye.